Sometimes students ask me, as a professor, you probably get this too, whether I've ever had a time of doubt. I know that for our students, they can view us as sort of these, pristine professors who know it all and have all the answers, and I think it's really important sometimes for them to hear that we don't.
Yeah.
And I often tell them the most poignant story I had was when I was a freshman at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill years ago, and I found myself in a religion class. When I got to college, I was a committed believer, following Jesus, trying my best to live the Christian life, grew up in a Christian home, thought I was ready for life at a university. Found myself in a religion class where the professor very quickly lectured with an eye towards evangelicals and seemed to understand who we were, and said that he was once an evangelical but now figured out the Bible isn't true after all, and proceeded to sort of attack its credibility on every conceivable level, from textual transmission to forgeries in the canon to the historical reliability of the accounts in the Gospels, and on it went. And I was just run over like a semi-truck. I didn't really know what to do. I didn't realize it at the time, but the professor I was having was going to become, he wasn't yet, one of the most famous critics of Christianity really in the world, Bart Ehrman, who a lot of people know now after all the books he's written. So there I was in my religion class, and it was a real moment of doubt for me, and I didn't know what to do, and I was watching people leave the faith over the class and compromise their beliefs. So what I did is I decided, look, I know there's got to be answers to the things that he's raising in the class. So I dug into the research as best I could as a freshman, and really started asking the question, has anyone addressed these issues before? And I quickly found out that they had done it many times, and they had done it very well throughout the history of the church. And so I was reassured in that these questions have been answered. And I've discovered ever since that almost every question I hear, it's really not ever new. Almost every one of them has been dealt with in the history of the church. And that's just one of the things I would say to people, is that, look, if you have a doubt, chances are this has been addressed. And if it's been addressed, take the time, be patient, dig into the research, and find an answer.
Yeah. One of the things through the years that I've doubted was how to put what I struggle with, how to put this loving God and a God of judgment.
Yeah.
And for me, I realized one of the things in talking to people, so this is really important, is to have, when you're struggling, is to have people in your life and communities where you can share your doubt, and not simply peers, although that's important, but people who've lived longer and who have likely struggled with some of these things too. And in some of those conversations, I remember realizing that sometimes I had trouble believing that God could love me, and I had trouble believing that God could be a God who also judges. And of course, there's a
you're both at the same time there. It's
at different times.
Yeah.
And I realized that some of this was a lot of this was an emotional, because rather than simply something I was, coldly kind of just plugging in a calculator in my brain, could these things be true? One of the things that helped me here was to not simply look at these doctrines, but to look through them, to begin to see how actually they make sense of the world. So when I first started studying apologetics, most of the stuff was looking at Christianity. And so if you believe in the resurrection, then you can believe in a God who is both loving and just. And so if I can just show the resurrection's true, if I can just show it historically has good evidence, then, well, that should solve that, right? Well, not really for me. I needed another step there. That was helpful, and everything does in some sense come back to the resurrection. But I needed to be able to actually look through these doctrines and see that they actually made sense to some deep intuitions that I had. And so when I looked at the world, I had this deep sense of longing for justice.
Right.
And I found that it wasn't just me, but it seems like humans have that imprinted on them. And then I also have this intuition that we're called to love. And I talk to secular friends, and they're saying, yes, the meaning of life is love. And so somehow these things must go together. Or can they go together, maybe is the question. But then when you look through the gospel, when you look through the Christian story, yes, they do go together. that even that God is judging because he loves a good creation, and it's sin that's destroying his good creation. And so these things actually can fit together, and they help me to see the world and even see my own deep intuitions and how they make sense of that. And I think the other part of this, so not only looking at and looking through these doctrines, but for me it was stepping into them and to live these out. And I do that through the worship in the church, through living out as we seek justice in our communities and also seek to love. And do that in light of the gospel. And I think that's actually important to remind me of the truth of the gospel in my doubts.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's line, and this is a paraphrase, which is that I don't believe in the sun because I stare at it. I believe in the sun because by it I see everything else. And I think that's a little bit about what it's like to examine the Christian system from the inside.
Yeah.
So rather than standing from the outside and saying, does that make sense? What you realize is that once you stand inside the Christian system, it makes everything else make sense. In other words, it's the light that illumines so many problematic areas. And I think that's really key for people who doubt. You've got to sort of think about Christianity holistically rather than atomistically. You can't just pick out one little thing and say, I don't believe or I don't find that persuasive. Is it as a system coherent and persuasive, and does it answer the big questions of life? And I think that's one of the big things that can help overcome someone's doubts.
It's big picture,
Yep.
and then allowing for mystery,
Yes.
allowing for uncertainties.
Yeah.
And we have that when we start talking about, we talk about children, or we start talking about some big questions, infants. And so right away, it introduces some things that we might have ideas of how this can be worked out, but we can also rest in a good God,
Right.
and so you go to doctrine of God, who can be trusted and yet hasn't revealed to us everything. And I often find myself going back to theology proper, doctrine of God,
Right.
and a recognition that I am not God, and that means there is going to be mystery. And if to completely kind of do away with mystery as we're trying to get these answers, actually, I think undercuts Christianity, because there is some paradoxes that we don't exactly know all of how things are going to fit together.
Well, it's actually very comforting for people to know that there's going to be things you don't get and don't understand. I talk to people all the time who are like, well, how can I believe if I don't have a comprehension of that? Or how can I believe if I haven't fully reconciled these two things over here? And I'm like, well, did you expect to understand God fully and comprehensively? Of course there's going to be places that you don't understand fully or can't answer. And I think just hearing from folks in the guild that, look, that's normal. Of course you're not going to have that answer, can be really reassuring to people. They can almost take a sigh of relief and go, okay, so I can still be a believer and have places where I'm still struggling and places where I don't fully understand. And that's actually fairly normal for a finite human being trying to understand an infinite God, and that I can just do what God asked me to do in that and trust him.
Well, and anyone who tells you otherwise is just selling you something.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's actually a mark of maturity to live with uncertainties.
Right.
It's not religious hocus pocus. We all live with uncertainties. And here's the other part. We all have to live somewhere. We all are going to adopt we all are going to have, even if we haven't articulated it, we have a certain narrative or script that we're living by. We assign meaning and value. And yet we can't prove why we should be living for this over this in a kind of hard rationalistic way. There's going to be mysteries and uncertainties. So actually, a mature life, I would even say an intellectually mature life, is learning to live with certain uncertainties. Yeah. And yet Christianity is this big picture that explains so much and yet leaves us with some mystery, but ultimately a God who in Christ has run to us and has come to us. And so even as we don't have all these answers, we can trust a God who in his Son has died for us. And so that gives me even great hope that in the end, when maybe this is all worked out for me, maybe I know I'll get more of the picture one day that, well, we'll see how God was actually pulling these things together.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that the story of the whole Bible, right?
Yeah.
You look at Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, being asked to do it and thinking, how could I reconcile this with the promises that this seed is the channel to keeping God's promises that will bless the nations. But that's where trust comes in. I think when you look back to someone who, or the hallmarks of faith, like Abraham, he still had doubts and questions and confusion, but that's, of course, what faith's all about.
Yeah, and I find solace in when you actually study theologians and you study the past, you realize that they had doubts.
Oh, yeah.
They were okay living with mysteries. They were okay at changing their minds at times about different things, and they saw themselves as very finite creatures. And I think part of, again, where doubt can help us is it kind of unmasks our pretensions, and that we are dependent creatures, we are finite. Mm-hmm. And so to kind of grasp for this ultimate knowledge is actually, it's not the human way, and it's not the way to flourishing. So we have to live with some of these uncertainties.